Thanks, everybody. And thanks to Mark Napper, who is one of the hardest working diplomats out there, or hardest working maybe in one of the hardest working folks in the State Department and in the U.S. government. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late at night. My name is Jung Pak. I'm the Korea chair at Brookings. I'm really pleased to be moderating this first panel with our distinguished colleagues at Brookings, as well as from East Asia Institute in Korea. Let me introduce our panelists very quickly. Let me start with our Korea team first. We have Dr. Jae-sung Chun, who is the chair of the National Security Research Center at the East Asia Institute and also professor at Seoul National University. Dr. Chun serves on the Policy Advisory Committee to the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Unification. He's the co-author of The Korean War, Threat and Peace, and Our Politics, Moral, and International Politics in East Asia, History and Theory. Dr. Young-sun Ha is the chairman of the Board of Trustees at the East Asia Institute and professor emeritus at Seoul National University. Dr. Ha serves as a member of a senior advisory group for the Inter-Korean Summit Talks Preparation Committee, and he also serves as a member of the Presidential National Security Advisory Group and on numerous research and policy organizations in Asia, the US, and Europe. Dr. Suk-jung Lee is a professor of public administration at Sungkyunkwan University and a senior fellow of the East Asia Institute. She has been directing the Asia Democracy Research Network since its formation in 2015, leading a network of about 19 research organizations across Asia to promote democracy with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy. She recently co-authored Transforming Global Governance with Middle Power Diplomacy, South Korea's Role in the 21st Century. Let me move over to our Brookings colleagues who are joining us. Lindsay Ford is a David Rubenstein Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Ford has served in a variety of roles within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, including as a special assistant to Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel for the 2014 U.S. ASEAN Defense Forum. Ford was also a leading architect of the Asia Rebalance Strategy work for the Department of Defense's 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance Review and oversaw the development of the first Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Strategy in 2015. And Lindsay Ford is always my go-to on all things Asia and security issues. Last but not least, one of my favorite people at Brookings on either coast, on the East and the West Coast, is Jonathan Pollack, who is a non-resident fellow at Brookings. Between 2012 and 2014, he served as director of the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings. He has authored or edited over 24 books and research monographs and has made important contributions to the study of China's international strategies, the political and security dynamics of the Korean Peninsula, East Asian international politics and US foreign and defense policies in Asia and the Pacific. So, after we hear from the panelists and we have a moderated discussion, I'm going to turn to you, the audience, for your questions. So please send your questions to events@brookings.edu or via Twitter to the @BrookingsFP handle using the hashtag US ROK. I'd like to ask our panelists to start up tee up some questions for them. And I wanted to turn to Drs. Chun and Ha. I think Dr. Chun is going to speak first, but South Korea sits in a very difficult geopolitical environment. On the one hand, it has a decades-old alliance with the United States designed to counter a dangerous North Korea. On the other, it is dependent on China for its economic security. Can you briefly explain the ways in which U.S.-China rivalry complicates South Korea's foreign policy choices? Let me turn this over to Dr. Chun first.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in this panel. My topic today, we'll talk about more South Korea's position, but first, U.S.-China rivalry, how South Korea sees it, especially after the 2020 presidential election. So let me briefly talk about this China rivalry from South Korea's perspective. So after President Trump's foreign policy, which defies any familiar past grand strategic concepts and categories. Now we have President-elect Biden's foreign policy, and his grand strategic ideas draws much attention. As domestic concerns rather than foreign policies will be critical once Biden takes office, but we can predict that very soon foreign policy issues will be very important. President-elect Biden has not made detailed mention regarding foreign policy besides general principles. Especially, we have great interest in U.S. China rivalry, but we know that Biden administration will focus on strengthening American power along with legitimacy and authority. His trust is multilateralism and norm diplomacy. The question then is, will the U.S. continue to maintain the role of the global hegemon, a liberal hegemon which provided the most fundamental collective international goods to contribute to the stability of international order? And we see that American power has, in fact, a little bit weakened during the U.S. unipolarity because U.S. has too much burden, and our ROK-US alliance was influenced by those changes. But South Koreans believe that there is no reason the U.S. should weaken its global leadership role when the world is in great peril and hardships. It is obvious that global complexities these days will pose greater challenge to the United States to take a role of leadership as in the past. And President-elect Biden's proposal for the Global Democratic Forum in this sense, probably South Korea will be part of the forum we wish, is a great idea to establish a collective mechanism for setting up and managing rule for norm-based international order. So let me go to South Korea's position. Biden administration may continue to adopt several policies of the current President Trump's policies, some of them. But how President Biden will conceive the ultimate end state relations with China is highly significant because, South Korea will be greatly influenced by that. If competition, especially rule-based competition and cooperation does not open the room for engaging with China, meaning that the room for inducing not just behavioral changes of China, but structural transformations of China in various areas, China will respond with confrontational policy. And outside pressure or overbalancing will strengthen Chinese nationalism, which in turn consolidate authoritarian resilience. But now we have a greater military gap between the United States and China is still largely unsurmountable. And when we count alliances as strong support, we still have an edge in military balance of power. So when the Democratic Forum works very effectively, there is likely to be still a chance to shape the future decisions of China. So there is no doubt that South Korea's most fundamental and long-term strategic proposal coincides with the U.S. South Korea has developed under the U.S.-led liberal international order and has contributed to strengthening this order, showing formidable followership. But for short term, as we all know, South Korea's economic dependence on China is great, and we have a North Korean problem that needs, to some extent, Chinese assistance or participation, active participation, such as sanctions and establishment of peace regime. For short term, from a more tactical point of view, we need a well-devised package to cope with the rise of China to sustain the Asian alliance network. So let me go through very briefly, and that is the end of the first round, which is first, we need a very flexible security architecture in which no sole security network of cooperation dominates. I think hub and spoke system so far worked fairly well, and we may combine more collective or minilateral network at the same time. Second, we need a formidable collective response system to cope with Chinese possible retaliation, especially using economic coercive means, to which South Korea has been very vulnerable. So deepening economic interdependence on the U.S. unipolarity will be reshaped anyway, but it will take time, and the optimal form of interdependence with China is yet to be determined. Third, as the degree of vulnerability to Chinese coercion and the need to cooperate with China in certain areas are different from countries to countries, for the time being, it's necessary to have a well-devised division of roles in making and implementing China policy with Asian allies. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ha. Dr. Ha, you're muted.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Following Professor Chan's remarks on the ROK-US alliance cooperation in the Asia U.S. China strategy competition as a kind of division of labor, I will briefly sum up another major issue, two administrations' cooperations for the denuclearization of North Korea. For this purpose, the most urgent task is the joint development of the new way of calculation for the complete denuclearization of North Korea. As we all know, after the failure of second Hanoi summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, North Korea has continuously complained the old way of calculation of the United States and advocated the new way of calculation for the successful summit. At the same time, North Korea strongly advocated his version of 3 stages of denuclearization as a new way of calculation. The first stage is the unilateral process of trust building. The second stage is a step-by-step simultaneous action for the exchange of the partial reduction of nuclear capabilities, excluding nuclear capabilities for minimum deterrence and the gradual lift of sanctions and the beginning of the peace building on the peninsula. The final and third stage is the implementation of both complete denuclearization of North Korea, including minimum deterrence, and the complete security guarantee on the basis of abolishment U.S. hostile policy toward North Korea, including U.S. forces in Korea and also nuclear strategic assets around the Korean Peninsula through nuclear arms control talks in the Asia Pacific. It shows that the North Korea is ready to negotiate partial reduction of nuclear capabilities as a compensation of gradual lift of sanctions. However, it is also clear that North Korea is not yet take the strategic decision to accept the complete denuclearization. Under these circumstances, ROK and the United States should make joint efforts in developing new roadmap of complete denuclearization and blueprint for North Korea's peace and prosperity in the 21st century. In the case of roadmap of complete denuclearization, bottom-up negotiations can start from the stepping stone of nuclear freeze for the final goal of complete denuclearization. However, as North Korea's sincerity of complete denuclearization has not yet proven, North Korea's comprehensive report of verification lists of nuclear capabilities should be needed as a confidence-building measures for the final stage of denuclearization. In the case of blueprint for North Korea's peace and prosperity for the 21st century, in parallel with the process of nuclear freeze, gradual sanction lift, and security guarantee for non-nuclear North Korea should begin to be implemented as confidence-building measures of developing friendly relations with North Korea. For the final stage of complete denuclearization and security guarantee, it is necessary for non-nuclear North Korea to reorganize itself politically, economically, socially, culturally, ecologically, and technologically to adjust itself to the 21st century. In this process of self-reorganization of North Korea for the 21st century, I think the regional peace system should be built to provide maximum security guarantee for non-nuclear North Korea. At the same time, the global support of North Korea's self-reorganization program should be arranged. Moon and Biden's joint efforts to design this kind of new way of calculation will be one of the most urgent tasks in the Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ha. Dr. Chun. Jonathan Pollock, Dr. Ha started talking about North Korea, and we've talked about this many, many times over in our offices at Brookings about North Korea. Tell us about, what are the implications for U.S. China rivalry on North Korea policy? And given some of the warming of ties between Beijing and Pyongyang, how does this all play in North Korea's calculus? As well as, and what does that mean for South Korea, you think? Jonathan, you're on mute. Still on mute.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yep.
Great, okay, good. I often get the feeling when we have discussions about North Korea that we're a bit like the old Bill Murray movie Groundhog Day, except that unlike the movie Groundhog Day, things don't get better, they get worse. I think we need to begin understanding about how we might proceed with a candid acknowledgement of where we are now, vis-a-vis both North Korea and China. The Trump administration made every effort to, on a unilateral basis, redefine the terms of reference on dealings with North Korea, perhaps in an effort to marginalize China, but that didn't work. It didn't work because, of course, to the degree that Mr. Trump, at least for appearance's sake, sought to change relations with North Korea, it gave Kim Jong-un much more latitude with respect to dealings directly with China. And it is true, there has been certainly a tactical warming of relations between China and North Korea. I don't know that I would claim, I don't think it entails a reaffirmation of security guarantees to North Korea. It is rather a sense of shared interest that there are animosities that both North Korea and China have towards the United States. But here again, I want to emphasize that let's, for the moment, set aside the legitimate issue of common values in our relations with the ROK and Japan, and let's look at the question of interests as it affects what China might or might not do vis-a-vis North Korea and its nuclear goals. In this respect, it's my own firm belief, and the Biden administration, not yet in office, is clearly articulating this, that there have to be areas in which we cooperate with China. And I happen to feel that nuclear non-proliferation is very, very high on that list. We must acknowledge, however, that 5 American presidents have tried to slow or prevent outright North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability, using the full range of political, economic, and diplomatic tools and strategies. None have achieved success, as we can see. And objectively speaking, I would argue that the circumstances today with North Korea going about its labors here, introducing new weapon systems, and leaving open the possibility that it will resume testing as a kind of an early welcome, should we say, a negative welcome for the Biden administration needs to be considered. We know, of course, that North Korea will hold its the 8th Congress of the Korean Workers' Party sometime in January. And it's possible that North Korea will unveil its thinking as they try to kind of acclimatize the new administration, as they have others, to what their priorities and goals are. But my real issue here is, if we are trying to find a way to deal with China, we have to recognize that China gets a vote in this process by history, by geography, by economic interest. The idea of separating China from where we might proceed vis-a-vis North Korea and its possible futures, it seems to me is very, very ill-advised at best. So the question then becomes, is there a basis here on which the United States could in fact reopen discussions with China that address questions related to North Korea's nuclear weapons and the long-term future of North Korea more generally? We should not be highly optimistic about these possibilities, but I see a window, a test case, if you will, of the ability and the interest of China to work with the United States or not work with the United States. It could go either way, depending on how we approach China in this area and whether or not we in fact state that there is a common American and Chinese interest in preventing the nuclear weapons development of North Korea, continued unconstrained nuclear weapons development in North Korea. My own belief would be, this is my last comment, I think a fully realized operational nuclear weapons capability by North Korea would be a strategic disaster for China and for the United States. And that should be a starting point in our discussions with China if we can arrive at candid understandings apart from all the standard formulas that are used have been used in the past to talk about these issues.
Thanks, Jonathan. I want to turn to Lindsay Ford now. Dr. Jae-Sung Chun talked about this in his opening remarks. South Korea has been reluctant to endorse or participate in the Trump administration's quadrilateral security dialogue. One senior advisor to the Moon administration said Seoul's participation in a NATO-like structure would create an existential dilemma for South Korea, and that China will, quote, treat us like an enemy. You argue that, though, in your paper that there is a way to enhance South Korea's role in regional defense networks. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, thanks, John. You know, in my paper, first I want to say the Quad is not going to become an Asian NATO. So I think right off the bat, we need to all just put aside that that is even a realistic prospect. But what I really say is that Korea and also US policymakers need to focus a lot less on whether or not South Korea participates in the Quad formally, and needs to think more about the underlying defense relationships that South Korea has with Quad countries. Because when you think about what facilitated the sort of revival and the momentum that we've seen in the quadrilateral security dialogue over the past couple of years, it's actually that the bilateral and then trilateral relationships between participating countries, especially like Japan and Australia, or Australia and India, grew a lot stronger in the years between 2007, when the Quad sort of first kicked off, and then its revival more recently. And so what it really is, it's been a step-by-step process. And I think there are similar opportunities for South Korea to, in a step-by-step way, enhance its own defense networks in the region. Beyond opportunity, I actually think there is a need to do this. This isn't about China, and it actually shouldn't be about China at all. And I realize that's perhaps a strange argument to be making in a panel discussion that's supposed to be about U.S. China competition. But I think actually we can't allow that focus on competition or even China to have a veto over how other countries think about cooperating with their neighbors in Asia. South Korea has its own interests in being able to shape the region around it. And more importantly, it has a lot of capacity as a strong middle power with a large economy and one of the region's most capable militaries. that it can bring to bear in working with neighbors to make Asia more prosperous and secure. There have been obviously some hurdles in recent years, not just China, but the rockiness of the relationship between Japan and South Korea. But when you look at the relationships between South Korea and two other Quad countries, Australia and India, they have really been steadily growing their defense ties for the last decade. And there's a lot of common ground there that you could begin to build on. For example, South Korea and India just signed a defense logistics agreement in 2019 that makes it more possible for them to do naval cooperation with each other, refueling. And notably, India is the only country other than the United States that South Korea has that kind of arrangement with. Similarly, Australia was the first country other than the United States that South Korea established a high-level 2+2, meaning foreign policy and defense dialogue with. So that basis and that foundation is there. What I think is that countries need to think about how they sort of build on that and move forward, and there are a few areas that they could explore. Maritime security, I think, is an obvious one. South Korea has a lot of economic interest in the Middle East, and that's been driving some of its cooperation with India in particular. You can look at things that India is doing, like creating an information fusion center to try to bring more maritime domain awareness and safe and secure shipping in the Indian Ocean. And I think there are places where South Korea, Australia, and India could all work together more in that space. Space is actually another one where North Korea has growing space and anti-space capabilities that I think are a concern for South Korea and will be more in the future. It's already conducting civilian cooperation with both India and Australia on space, but there's a need to take that into the defense realm as well, to have dialogues about space security, rules of the road in space, what kinds of cooperation you could create to make the civilian capabilities that all of these countries are building more secure. And then finally, an obvious one here would be defense industry cooperation, where there have been growing conversations between South Korea and India and Australia about R&D cooperation. South Korea has a growing defense industry that is selling abroad, including to India and Australia. But you have to think about this as more than just dollars and cents. It can't just be transactional. What this does is it actually creates opportunities as well to think about interoperability between these militaries. So where are there exercises that these countries could do together, building on the capabilities that they are increasingly going to have in common? Australia, for example, has a large annual exercise, Talisman Sabre. Both India and South Korea already participate as observers. These are the kinds of things looking forward where you could begin to actually participate in a more routine and regular way. None of this means South Korea has to participate in the Quad. What it does mean, though, is I think it puts you on a trajectory in the long term to have the kinds of flexible defense networks that you heard Dr. Chun talking about earlier.
Thanks, Lindsay, for those excellent and really meshed well with what Dr. Jae-Sung Chun led us off with. I wanted to turn to Dr. Suk-Jung Lee. The East Asia Institute has some fascinating data on South Korean public opinion regarding the U.S. China rivalry and the U.S. South Korea alliance, and breaking them down by demographic. Can you talk to us about 2 or 3 key takeaways from that survey and the implications for President Moon's policies in the remaining 18 months or so of his term?
Okay, it's good to see you, Dr. Jung Park, online. It's midnight in Seoul, so you know, I allow me if I don't sound coherent enough. Okay, as you have mentioned, the East Asia Institute has carried out many public opinion surveys, and the one survey I'm going to use is our national identity survey. So using from 2005 to 2020 this year. So I'm glad to report that since the mid-2000s, South Koreans' support for the alliance has been solidified. We usually ask the autonomy and neutral and the support for the alliance. And over the last 15 years, there is a 17.6% gains in the band of the alliance support. So that's a good sign. Okay, then who would be the supporter. And I checked the demographic background, and of course, the South Koreans who are aged 16 and over are most ardent supporter of the alliance with USA. But don't discount this age group, including myself, because this population accounts about a quarter of the total population of South Korea. And we usually discuss whether there is ideological, like a progressive or conservative, or the ruling party and the opposition party, the kind of the ideological and partisan identity. Actually, those factors don't influence South Koreans' attitude toward the alliance that much, not at all. And also the repetitive findings throughout the survey is that the more educated and also the more strong believers in democracy tend to be more critical about the alliance with the USA. I guess obviously the more educated and then the democracy believers tend to believe the equal partnership, and they have a strong national pride. So that kind of things are related negatively with the support of the alliance. And next question is, why many Koreans support the alliance relationship with the USA? The most important factor I found through statistical analysis is that the very high favorability of the United States. Usually we use a typical 100 degrees thermometer, and the America scored 67.5 degree in 2015 survey, and this year 62 degree. Actually, that's much higher when we compare to other countries. For example, China, this warm feelings toward China had decreased over the last 5 years. Maybe this is related to the side issues of economic retaliation from China government. And very interestingly, the most young generation who are aged 18 to 29, they feel very warmly about United States. So this is even higher than the old group who are more than aged 60. So this is a good sign. This young generation will sustain the alliance because they like the USA. Okay, and also among the threat perception, naturally, South Koreans who feel threatened because of North Korea, then they tend to support the alliance with the USA more. I was curious, so I checked the China threat, and of course, more Koreans these days feel threatened by China. However, when we measure with other factors together, the China threat perception, even though South Koreans feel great, doesn't affect them much in the support of the alliance. And also, I checked the threat perception of China-US rivalry because many Koreans are worried because we are pushed to choose either of them. But actually, the majority, more than 64%, want to South Korea take a neutral position in these competitions. However, if they are pushed to choose either of them, twice more Koreans I think we have to be close to US side rather than China side. So I checked with their relationships, and many Koreans feel feared of entanglement. So if the conflict is high between USA and China, they think it may be dangerous if we are too much loyal to the alliance. So this threat perception driving from the rivalry between two great powers affect negatively to the strong support to the alliance. I think that is related to not only Moon Jae-in government and also the president-elect Biden's next government. So let's say if they push too much about this Quad from the military perspective, I think many Koreans will say, no, it's too much. But however, if you, as Lindsay has mentioned, there are many other ways to engage South Korea in Indo-Pacific strategy of the USA. And overall, the alliance support from South Korea is very high. So it's good for the 같이 갑시다 for both presidents. So let me stop here. So because I have to, I have only 5 minutes.
No, thank you. That's great. And I know it's midnight, and this is a very late time for you. So thanks to our panelists from Seoul and for our viewers in Asia watching this. It's morning in DC, so my kind of muddling through I have no excuse at all. Dr. Lee, I'm reminded of some recent polls. There was a Pew Research Center poll that said that 83% of Koreans had no confidence in Xi Jinping to do the right thing on world affairs. And a Chicago Council poll said that only 14% of Koreans saw China as a reliable partner. And I think some of those, that negative responses on China's role and China's activities really is incongruent with some of the soft power things that China has been trying to do, and the fact that the tourism from China is, South Korea's biggest, source of tourism, and that more Koreans and Chinese engage in student exchanges than with any other country. So I think that's really interesting that kind of negative reaction exists alongside that very, these person-to-person exchanges. Before we go into a moderated discussion, I have some follow-up questions for our panelists. I wanted to remind our audience that if you have questions, I know some of you have already submitted some, please send an email to events@brookings.edu or on Twitter at the handle @BrookingsFP, #USROK. Underlying this discussion today is a fundamental question about the future of the U.S. South Korea alliance, how to modernize it, more flexible, as Dr. Chun mentioned, and more broadly, what the regional security architecture should look like. Given the different national priorities and threat perceptions of China and the China challenge, how do we move forward with closer defense cooperation? Lindsay Ford outlined some of these steps earlier. What are some near-term actionable measures that Washington and Seoul can take individually and together? And let me turn to Dr. Chun and Dr. Ha. If you can take this on, Dr. Chun, you mentioned the idea of a U.S.-ROK strategic dialogue and other flexible ways of dealing with this, not this monolithic NATO-like structure. What kind of input can Seoul provide? Lindsay Ford mentioned a whole series of things on maritime security, space security, and that South Korea is already doing some of these networking with Quad countries. So can you, Drs. Chun or Ha, elaborate on what Seoul can provide in those dialogues and what types of initiatives Seoul would be willing to take?
Well, first thing I'm thinking of is the advent of the liberal international order in 1940s, when the United States suggested that order, which was very good. It was a package deal. It was composed of the hub and spoke alliance and massive economic assistance, and with a very good ideational lead for human rights and market economy. And right now we need that kind of package, when South Koreans are fearful of Chinese influence in some sense, basically retaliation. When we strengthen our alliance for the regional security architecture, which is good, but we have experienced already Chinese retaliation, even though we have a FTA with China after the THAAD incident, plus, the COVID-19 crisis. So when we think of that package, US and South Korea should think of how to collectively respond or minimize any possible harm that can come from a not really legal response from China. That's one. And the second thing is that we need some principles, U.S. action toward China may be viewed as just balancing against China, which is some kind of theoretically realistic response. But as President-elect Biden said, some kind of principled pragmatism is very important. So we have to reinforce norm-based order. Then even though we are acting in the same way, we have to suggest universal norms first in dealing with 5G, South China Sea, sea lane, all these things. Even though we are coping with Chinese problems, but we have to first agree on the principles. Then South Korea can act on the principle of those universal norms, which will give us some excuse or justification to, stand against, in some sense, Chinese influence. Okay, let me stop here.
Thank you. Dr. Ha, if you have any comments, you're on mute. You're on mute, Dr. Ha. Dr. Ha, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Let me add a couple of things. President-elect Biden's would like to use the two key words, one as the American leadership instead of America first. Second one as the example of democracy rather than peace through strength, as President Trump usually used two words. But it is a very much better shift or better changes for not only for the United States, but also globe as a whole. But one thing I would like to mention is that, as we all know, we are now just entering the so-called post COVID-19 world order. In that sense, I think the situation will be changed very rapidly. As we all know, not only the United States, but also China has not very much successful to manage the current crisis. So what will be the next key environment, key issues we are facing? I think another more key word might be the complexity rather than the traditional key principles of words we used during the previous world order. In that sense, I think both the ROK and U.S. Can cooperate. How to implement that kind of the new situation of complexity. For instance, in the case of actors, complexity of actors in that cases, it is critical how we should manage the China as a part of the complex actors in this arena. Second, in the complexity of stage as a value or norm stages, democracy is rapidly emerging during the Biden administration, but it is also considered, well, we should also very much well aware of the importance of the prudent diplomacy stages and the final complexity of performances. So far, we are usually very much get used to the cooperation, competitions, or the conflicts, but in a long-term perspective, in the era of post-19 world order, I think symbiosity might be another key word, In that sense, I think ROK and U.S. can be face much more broader arenas. We can cooperate, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Lee, one of the findings of or some of the recommendation in your paper was that the U.S. should, as you looked at some of the demographics, the younger generation, that you recommend the U.S. employ a more public diplomacy on soft power type of relationships. Can you elaborate on that and how and what? And I'm reminded of what Dr. Chun had said about returning to principles, these norms, right? What kind of soft power diplomacy or public diplomacy were you thinking about as you were writing this paper and providing these recommendations?
Well, you remember what the national confidence and the democratization of South Korea, we had subscribed anti-American sentiments in early 2000s and also in late 1990s to the base issues and then the environmental issues. And that was peaked in 2002, the massive candlelight protest due to Yul Sohn mission, this tragic deaths of 2 schoolgirls that had led to the public demand to revise so far the status of forces agreement because many Koreans felt our national sovereignty was infringed. Ever since the U.S. armies in South Korea had done very good job, outreaching the communities and doing some kind of public diplomacy, and also the American government overall, I think, are very cautious and more trying to engage the South Koreans in equal footing, respecting South Korea as a partner rather than a client of American patriot. So in that matter, I think the President-elect Biden's approach to South Korea as an important ally, he has emphasized that he will respect the alliance partners, and South Korea is one of them. So I think in that matter, many Koreans feel will be a little bit, eased from the pressure to increase the hosting the U.S. armies in South Korea. And then we worried about the President Trump's transactional approach to the chorus alliance, the U.S.-Korea alliance, and even we worry that he may withdraw American armies from South Korea. So that kind of worries, kind of disappear, and that's a good sign. So I think that kind of public diplomacy, President himself, and also, of course, state, the top leaders in the State Department and the American Embassy in Korea, they are all important. And also, the one great things I'm observing these days is that South Korean government and many leaders are kind of moving towards the regional and global corporations in democracy and health, especially after pandemic, and this day, the climate change. Now, President Moon has introduced the Green New Deal, and tonight's news, I heard President Moon pledged a commitment of 10 million of vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccines, to developing countries. So all these signs are very good to reciprocate President-elect Biden's gesture to engage the partner allies in a more wider regional and global agenda.
Thank you. When we talk about this regional order, Jonathan, Lindsay, or anybody on the panel, can the U.S. accept China as a co-equal major power? Jonathan?
That is what, in an American context, we might call the $64 question. I think what we confront with China is obviously a country whose internal norms, some of its really hideous policies directed in Xinjiang against the Uyghur minority, highly punitive policies towards Hong Kong, worries about the relationship with Taiwan, all are front and center. These are decisions that the leadership of China is making. We might judge them very unwise and even ominous, but for now, those are where their priorities have gone. And we should be candid about this, John. If I look back on the record of the Trump administration, it has seemed at times almost eager to make this relationship as difficult and as problematic as possible. In essence, questioning whether there was a legitimacy to those who govern China. And some people look at much of what the administration has said, including Pompeo, even in recent days, are kind of goading China in ways that will provoke Chinese nationalism one way or another. None of this is an endorsement of China and its priorities, but the reality of China as the world's second biggest power, and that the United States and China will be the preeminent powers in the world for as far as we can see, are facts. The question is, what kind of a competition exists? Competition is not an inherently bad word. The question, does it go overtly in very adversarial directions? If so, that creates enormous complexity, to use Professor Ha's word, for a position of a state like the ROK. So that one way or another, it does seem to me we have to test the possibilities, even as we have profound differences with China in so many areas, of where our interests do overlap, whether it is, as mentioned before, about COVID, mentioned about climate change, non-proliferation, a host of other areas that the reality of China can't be denied. However, we object so much to China's internal course of action. Let me, though, if I could, raise one or two other issues very, very quickly that go in this context. This has been a very, very lively and interesting discussion. It seems to me I'm hearing very, very different maps of the future coming from different panelists. We might say there is from the point of view of South Korean threat perception, how does South Korea divide up its attention and its interest with respect to North Korea, with respect to China, and then what Lindsay very usefully raised with respect to Asia as a whole? These are all very, very different. Can South Korea, as we might say, walk and chew gum at the same time? There is also, to be very, very frank, there's the question of Japan. So when I listen to these conversations about affirming the importance of U.S. alliance relations in East Asia, ones that I endorse very, very strongly, I'm still left troubled, to say the least, by the absolute inability of Japan and Korea to arrive at some tolerable set of understandings about the long-term future. They are each going their separate ways, and when allies of the United States are articulating very, very different policy directions, this is very, very unhealthy for the kind of larger long-term issues that we would wish to see if there is to be a coalescence among the democracies of East Asia on the road ahead. To the degree that they are very divided, that is like a gift to China. And this is something I think that the citizens of South Korea have to address. I would also like to see President Moon think more about these possibilities at the same time that we have a new, possibly interim leadership in Japan. If we just persist in the same old habits, we're not going to make the kind of headway that we need to. One final comment. Mark Napper emphasized that it's really, you know, we don't want to really get all that involved in all of this. I beg to differ. Unless and until the United States demonstrates a capacity here not to referee a dispute, but to push, frankly, Japan and South Korea to different understandings about the future, we're not going to get anywhere. I don't think that we want to miss the opportunity that exists now that we have collectively dodged the bullet, if you will, of the most destructive presidency in American history. That the alliance persists, support for it is there. I am very heartened by that. Let's just reflect candidly and truly deeply on how we proceed ahead in a way that strengthens common interests and reduces the possibility of damage. Others are watching us right now. Let's do this right if we can.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think you bring up the question that I wanted to direct at Lindsay first, and maybe for the South Korean colleagues to comment. Lindsay, you've pointed in your paper and elsewhere that there's a tension between the broad Indo-Pacific and some other visions versus South Korea's focus on the peninsula. And how, and I think Jonathan was referring to this, that limits some of South Korea's aspirations and goals on the new Southern policy and its influence in the region. Can you talk about that? And maybe we can ask our South Korean colleagues to respond.
Sure, thanks, John. You know, for a long time, the alliance, as well as the South Korean government, have been quite focused on the peninsula. And let's be clear, that makes a lot of sense because when you have a neighbor to the north that is seeking nuclear weapons, there is a need to focus on security at home. So I don't think acknowledging that there has been a very peninsular focus, both in the alliance and in South Korean foreign policy, necessarily is a critique or anything that does not make sense. It certainly does. But I think when you look forward to where South Korea is going as a country, it is increasingly building economic ties with not just neighbors, but around the world. We heard Mark Napper earlier talking about areas where South Korea has made tremendous contributions globally. But there has been, and I have heard former Assistant Secretary of Defense Randy Schreiber describe it this way, almost sort of a gap or a donut hole in alliance cooperation between what we do on the peninsula and what we do globally, where the region is missing. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, because arguably that's the area where South Korea has the greatest degree of interests, far more than in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world in its own neighborhood. And so together as the alliance, and also as a part of the Moon administration's New Southern policy, I think there's room to think about how South Korea contributes more in the region. The New Southern policy has done a lot in terms of putting forward sort of a vision on the diplomatic and on the economic side. It mentions peace and security, but I think as of yet, it's not totally clear what contributions the New Southern policy might make that are more focused on security or defense. So I think that as a place to start, the Moon administration could perhaps begin building out and articulating what its vision of sort of a security-focused pillar of the New Southern policy could look like. And I think it was Dr. Chun who spoke earlier about sort of grounding this in principles for the region. I think that's very sensible. I think what you really need is a sense from the Moon administration, if there is this multilateral architecture, what does South Korea see as its own place in that architecture? What priorities would it have for that type of architecture? And perhaps those are the kinds of conversations that in the strategic dialogue we were talking about, you can have. Because these minilateral networks that have been evolving in the region, the reality is particularly on the defense side, South Korea has really been absent. There is a relationship, a trilateral dialogue between Japan and South Korea and the US, but it's been difficult to move that forward. There hasn't been similar cooperation with some of the other countries. And so I think if South Korea can come in and say, this is how the new Southern policy contributes to peace and security, this is where we see our role in moving some of these priorities forward in the region, then that creates the space to begin building those discrete, I guess, links between the hubs in the hub and spoke system.
Thanks, Lindsay. Let me weave in a question from the audience before I ask the South Korean colleagues to comment. North Korea is always the outlier here, and it always seems to be hijacking and constraining South Korea's policy choices because, as Dr. Chun and Drs. Ha and Lee have mentioned before, South Korea needs China or perceives that it needs China to deal with the North Korea problem. So let me toss it out to Drs. Chun, Ha, and Lee for their final thoughts on all of this.
Well, okay. Let me first speak a little bit. You know, there are many questions. Those are very important questions. First, where are South Korea positions in dealing with regional security architecture? I think just we are entering into the period of U.S. China rivalry. You know, in 2013, there was a statement by President Obama and Xi Jinping about the new model of great power cooperation, not competition. So it's just 5 or 6 years old when we talk about U.S. China rivalry. So we have to have some time of adjustment to this grand structural transformation. And South Korea has adopted to U.S. unipolarity, relatively peaceful period. So we have to deal with our economic dependence on China. You know, our 70% of the national income comes from the export, and 27% of export come from China. So probably 20% of our GDP comes from China. But anyway, we already felt the need to diversify our economic relations because China sometimes weaponized the interdependence in an economic sense. And in dealing with North Korean problem, you know, as Dr. Chung said, there is a perception in South Korea we need some kind of assistance from China, or at least we have to prevent South Korea sanction evasion. So we have to deal with China anyway. But we have a strong need to deal with North Korea's denuclearization. So at some point, probably we will have some other opportunity. But right now, we should have some relations with China. In Korea-Japan relations, I think it might be historic problem, but it's also a structural problem because the rise of military China is a chance for Japan to militarize or normalize Japan's position. But as I said, you know, the rise of China is a problem for South Korea for denuclearization of North Korea. So there is a different interest structure, not just historical problem. And United States may find a leeway to adjust these differences between two countries. And lastly, South Korea's position in regional architecture in terms of security, I think we need some time. But basically, South Korea feels that we should have a stable regional order. We know that we have to care about, you know, the South China Sea in terms of sea lane, maritime disputes, which will, in the long run, affect South Korea's security position. We are right now dealing with non-traditional security, at least. But I think South Korea will have some kind of very concrete indicator to show how China's rise will give us a security threat. So if we have that very concrete measure how to deal with, you know, China's rise in terms of security threat, then at some point, if necessary, we have to deal with those traditional type of security architecture problem as time goes by.
Thank you. Dr. Ha or Dr. Lee, do you have any 5 or 10 seconds of final thoughts?
5 seconds.
5 seconds.
Korean issue actually is not only for the Korean issues. In particular, in the arena of military matters, peace on the Korean Peninsula is not the peninsula matters. It's also one of the critical matters for the regional architecture and also the global architecture. In that sense, I think we do rather successfully play the role of national, regional, global role at the same time.
Thank you. Dr. Lee?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to Lindsay's point that South Korea is active in peninsula and also in the globe, but bypassing region. I think it is related to the increasing dilemma and of resolving the nuclear issue of North Korea, because of this North Korean threat became so immense to South Korea. I think our imagination of regional policy has been more narrowed. But if you look at the before, like Kim Dae-jung period, we had a great vision of East Asia. And then when we move to Northeast Asia, we have a NAPC and many other great ideas building up the peace cooperation, focusing on North Korea. But it's not successful because North Korea is, crowded with very strong countries. So that's why we became kind of weakened, taking back East Asia again. And just 1 second for the Japan-Korea, these issues. And I like to say there are a lot of government leadership failure from both countries, but many private sector, including East Asia, we think the good relationship with Japan is critical to the peninsula and to the region.
Thank you so much to all of our distinguished panelists. Thank you for a lively conversation this morning, and to everyone in the audience who joined us. With deep apologies to the president of East Asia Institute, Yul Sohn, who's moderating our second panel. Thank you to all of you. Dr. Sohn, over to you.